Hello students. This video will give you help creating a bad news message using the indirect approach. First of all, what is the indirect approach? As Carden states, the indirect approach means that you'll provide supporting reasons first, followed by the primary message. Because the primary message in any bad news communication is the bad news itself, using a brief buffer and explaining your reasons for the bad news means that the primary message itself is delayed. So what's the point of using the indirect approach when the overwhelming majority of business messages, including some bad news communication, use the direct approach? And what determines its use? Start with thinking about your audience. Who is it? Is it a customer or a client? An employee? Is it your boss or a close colleague? All of those things can determine whether you use the indirect approach. Next, think about the severity of the news. Is this a fairly routine or insignificant message? Then direct is more appropriate. Is it difficult to hear or life-changing? Face-to-face is almost mandatory in those cases. Less severe but still disappointing means that while face-to-face may not be necessary, the indirect approach can help blunt the impact and help your audience understand the reason for the bad news. While your bad news message assignment prompt is likely not life-changing, it is still disappointing and maybe even worrying or upsetting. For this reason, you will use the indirect approach to help ease your audience into hearing the bad news. So, there are certain guidelines that do govern how to set up the indirect message. First is your buffer. There are some guidelines here that govern your buffer. Keep it brief, 1 to 2 sentences. Going on too long here could frustrate your reader or lull them into believing they'll hear a yes response. Keep it neutral. Too positive and the reader will think they're getting a yes response. Too negative and you've defeated the purpose of the buffer. And finally, it should consist of your entire first paragraph. You won't actually give the bad news until the second paragraph. Next is your rationale. What is the rationale? Think of it as the explanation of or reason for the bad news. There are some guidelines here to follow. First of all, your rationale must precede the actual bad news. If you wait to explain, you may have already lost the reader. Don't rely on company policy unless you explain the reason for the policy. You want to give a logical, clear reason and explanation. It's really important to use concise language here. This is something you want to try to achieve with all your business writing, but using overblown language here or vagueness may be seen as an attempt to avoid the truth. So be as transparent as possible. And finally, give the complete explanation before you give the bad news. Don't split it with the bad news. In other words, don't start giving your explanation, then give the bad news, and then continue with the explanation. Make sure you give the full explanation first. Next, of course, is the bad news itself. When you're giving the bad news, try to avoid overly negative words and phrases such as unfortunate, regret, and unable, and so on. Use neutral or more positive language. If you can, imply the bad news in your explanation. If you can do that, then there will be no reason to boldly and baldly state the bad news. So can your rationale lead to the clear conclusion of the bad news? But by the same token, you need to be clear even as you imply the bad news. You want to be sure that the reader does understand that they are receiving a no response. Again, if this isn't clear, your reader will be frustrated, confused, and even angry, and you and your company will likely be seen as unethical. Next, you'll discuss the impacts, and these are the impacts on your reader. So, while you want to focus on the reader throughout your message, here in particular, you want to be sure that you're focusing on impacts to the reader. So you want to express understanding and sympathy, but you also want to limit this. Overstating this or going on too long about it could result in either you're sounding as though you actually disagree with your company or making the reader feel even worse than before about the bad news. Avoid discussing impacts on the company. The reader isn't concerned at this point about anything but their own reaction to the bad news. Discussing impacts on the company may imply that you're more concerned about the company than about the reader. And finally, are there any benefits or silver linings to the reader? Don't do backflips trying to come up with these if absolutely none exist. Be respectful of your reader and avoid making these up in order to deflect from the bad news. Instead, these benefits should rise naturally from the situation, meaning that you want to keep them real, but don't assume there are none just because you can't think of any off the top of your head. Analyze the situation. They may be there, but you simply haven't thought of them yet. Next, can you offer an alternative? Is there something you can do for the reader? This will go a long way towards showing caring, giving you something positive to focus on, and maintaining relationships. For example, this might be a coupon, a discount, or a partial refund if you're writing to a customer. For internal communications, perhaps it's an alternative date or an offer to revisit something at a later date or within a particular time period. Finally, your last step is goodwill. The goodwill step should consist of your entire conclusion. There are some really important guidelines to follow here. Be sure that you don't repeat the bad news. If you've been clear, as you should be, in giving the bad news, then there should not be a reason to repeat it here. And doing so will likely just leave a bad taste in the reader's mouth. Instead, focus on the future. Keep it brief, but not abrupt. Watch tone here. And finally, avoid extending the discussion of this particular issue. So an offer for further communication can oftentimes do exactly that. Hopefully, this short explanation will help you as you compose your bad news message.